Welcome to the Digital Identity Digest, the audio companion to the blog at Spherical Cow Consulting. I'm Heather Flanagan, and every week I break down interesting topics in the field of digital identity, from credentials and standards to browser weirdness and policy twists. If you work with digital identity but don't have time to follow every specification or hype cycle, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. So a few weeks ago, I argued that appeals are not failures in process, right? Standards organizations need a way for people to challenge decisions they cannot live with. Without that, consensus really becomes a polite word for exhaustion, hierarchy, or whoever had enough time to remain on the call after everyone else gave up. A healthy process has to make room for principled dissent, right? It has to allow someone to say, this is wrong and the result needs to change. But there is another side to that process. The same mechanisms designed to protect fairness can be used to grind a group down. Appeals, objections, procedural complaints, meeting challenges, and behaviors that hover just below the line of a code of conduct issue can all become tools for obstruction. And at that point, the effect is no longer to improve the work, it is to make the progress so costly that everyone else eventually steps away. And that's when the process stops protecting the work. The first distinction we need to make here is between dissent and obstruction, right? Disagreement is not abuse. Standards development depends on people being willing to say when they believe something is wrong. Real dissent can be persistent and uncomfortable. It can come from someone who believes the group is overlooking a serious security, privacy, accessibility, deployment, or governance problem. And sometimes the person is right. Sometimes they're partly right. Sometimes they're wrong, but the concern still forces the group to explain its decision more clearly. That is healthy. Obstruction, however, is different, right? That's when process becomes weaponized, when someone uses the rules less to resolve a concern than to make forward progress costly, risky, or impossible. The pattern is not simply that someone keeps disagreeing. The pattern is in that disagreement can never be resolved. Every answer produces a new procedural objection. Every decision becomes an evidence of bias. Every attempt to move forward becomes proof that the group is suppressing dissent. A request for specifics is treated as evasion, while an effort to summarize the group's position is challenged as bad faith. Eventually, the technical work becomes secondary to just managing conflict. Now, standards organizations do recognize this as a tension, right? The IETF working group guidance, for example, describes that as part of a chair's job as balancing open and fair consideration against the need to make forward progress. If you have too little openness, dissent gets suppressed. Too little discipline, and the process can be used to make progress impossible. The difficult part is that both failures can be defended in the language of fairness, right? Process abuse rarely announces itself as abuse, right? If it did, it would be very easy to handle. Hi, I'm about to abuse the process. Me. I mean, it often looks like one more request to revisit a decision, one more claim that the group did not follow the process correctly, one more demand that the chair prove, again, that a concern was considered. It may be that an appeal that repackages an already answered argument without new evidence. It may be an attempt to reopen a settled issue through slightly different wording. It may be a procedural flooding where the group spends more time responding to complaints about its process than improving the specification. Sometimes it involves accusations that the chairs, editors, or contributors are biased, incompetent, or acting in bad faith. And sometimes minor ambiguity is treated as proof that the entire outcome is invalid. And sometimes it means staying just barely on the acceptable side of a code of conduct while making everyone else miserable. And that last form is really difficult, right? Standards organizations tend to be better at handling technical disagreement than handling people who understand exactly where the behavioral line is and hover over it. Now, there may be no single obviously sanctionable statement. Instead, the person creates drag and fear, or they make participation expensive in ways that are hard to capture in one meeting note or one complaint. And by the time the pattern becomes undeniable, many of the people most worth keeping have already stepped back. Now, I could point to several public examples here, actually. Now, I know there's going to be some people listening to this going, wait, is she talking about me? Is she talking about my situation? The thing is I talked to at least half a dozen people just for this one blog post, right? So I could point to several public examples, but you know what? I'm not going to do that. It's not because those examples are hard to find. If you're willing to have a conversation where there's no recording devices, plenty of people will talk about these things, right? The problem is in naming them would almost certainly turn it into a fight about the people involved and with the people involved rather than just talking about the pattern that I'm trying to describe. More bluntly, I do not trust people who behave this way to learn from criticism. I expect some of them will simply make me, personally, the next target, and I do not have time or energy to donate myself to that particular bonfire. And that right there is part of the problem, right? If standards development is going to involve more people, especially people who are not already steeped in its culture, it has to be safe enough for them to participate. Not perfectly comfortable, not free from disagreement, not protected from criticism, but safe enough that raising a concern, chairing a difficult discussion, editing a controversial draft, or asking a naive but useful question does not mean signing up for personal attack, procedural harassment, or months of escalation. Protecting that kind of participation while preserving the right to object may be one of the hardest jobs for the leadership of any standards organization, right? The line is just not always obvious. Sometimes the person blocking the work genuinely believes that they are doing the right thing. They may think the technology is harmful, that the architecture is dangerous, or that the group is moving too quickly. They may see themselves as the last responsible person standing in the way of a bad outcome. And again, sometimes they may even have a point. Intent matters, but in the end, it is not the whole story. Someone may be sincere and may even be right about the underlying risk, but sincerity does not erase impact. Believing you are right does not give you permission to make participation unsafe for everyone else. The standards process has to allow for principled dissent. It does not have to reward procedural warfare. When process is weaponized, the obvious cost is delay, right? The document doesn't advance, the issue queue grows, meeting time disappears into procedural churn, chairs write defensive summaries instead of helping the group make decisions, editors defend the same choices repeatedly instead of improving the text. That's pretty much the obvious, right? And super obvious costs there. But the deeper cost is who just gives up and leaves, right? People engage in standards because they care about the technology, the users, the public interest, the architecture of a deployed reality. They want to solve technical problems in ways that other people can implement, and they want to work to be better because they were there. That motivation is really powerful, but it's not infinite. When contributors have to stop thinking about the technical problem and start thinking about how to survive the next procedural attack, the work becomes less worth doing. Experienced people kind of leave quietly. New contributors decide the room's not for them. Editors burn out. Chairs become cautious or numb. Implementers with real deployment knowledge go back to the work that pays them. Meetings may continue. Repository may remain active. The process can appear to function even after something important has been lost. Now, a few weeks ago, I watched this happen and again, I'm not naming names for, safety reasons, but I did watch this unfold in another group, not mine. A senior developer was pushing their agenda super hard, right? And other people were stepping back. Eventually, the person making collaboration unbearable was the only person left to advance the work. That is such a perverse reward, right? The group did not intend to reward bad behavior, but when the person creating the problem is the one who remains, the process has selected for endurance rather than judgment. It's selected for aggression rather than collaboration and obstruction rather than contribution. If the process drives away the careful people and leaves the most combative person holding the pen, it has not preserved consensus. It has laundered dysfunction into authorship. So, what can an individual do when caught in the middle of this, right? Well, your first instinct is probably to argue harder, as entirely understandable, but let me assure you that is a trap. Most argument creates more material to challenge. Every clarification becomes another opening, and every attempt to prove good faith becomes another demand to prove it again. Your second instinct is to give up, which is understandable too. And you know what? Sometimes that might be the right personal decision. But if you are trying to remain involved, the most useful thing you can do is just keep clear documentation before you need it. That answer is deeply unsatisfying because documentation does not stop the behavior in the moment. It does not restore the joy in the work or give you the release of winning an argument. But what it does do is give you something to stand on if escalation becomes necessary. Keep track of the decisions being challenged. Save links to issue comments, minutes, and mailing list threads, pull requests, consensus calls, and prior resolutions. Note when the same concern has already been raised and answered. Record the difference between new substantive issues and another attempt to reopen a settled one. If the behavior is affecting participation, document that too. Which discussions were derailed? What work stalled? How much meeting time was consumed? When did people stop engaging? The point is not to build a secret prosecution file, right? It is to avoid reconstructing months of dysfunction while you are already exhausted. Now, if escalation becomes necessary, you do want to be able to say, here's the pattern, here are the examples, here's the effect on the work, and here's the help the group needs. This is so much more useful than saying, this person is impossible, even when they are, maybe especially when they are, right? Clear records help distinguish forceful dissent, ordinary frustration, procedural confusion, and actual abuse. And that distinction matters because the goal is not to punish disagreement, it is to protect the work, the participants, and legitimacy of the process. If someone keeps reopening a settled issue, ask what new information changes the earlier decision and link to the record. If someone makes broad accusations, ask for the specific decision, text, conduct, or process step at issue. If someone repeatedly hovers near the code of conduct line, document the pattern and its effect on participation rather than relying on one borderline incident. If the chair is absorbing all the conflict, then there support escalation to staff, or you probably will have an ombuds function or area director. You'll have a governance body. And if you are burning out, step back if you need to, but leave a clear record where possible so the next person isn't starting from nothing. It's pretty easy to say that chairs should handle this. Chairs do have a huge responsibility to manage the process and protect participation. But I hate to say this, chairs are people too, and they're often targets. In volunteer-driven communities, chair may be absorbing the conflict while trying to keep the work moving, supporting the editors, maintaining trust, and avoiding making the situation worse. If the only answer to process abuse is that the chair should be stronger, then the organization has actually failed the chair. Chairs are your first line of defense, but the first line should not mean the only line. The answer here is not to, I'm not suggesting make the process weaker, right? Don't weaken appeals. Don't make dissent harder. That's the wrong lesson to take from all of this. The answer is to protect the process from being used against itself through clear records, specific objections, neutral review when necessary, consistent meeting discipline, and real support for chairs, editors, and contributors. It also means recognizing that a pattern of near-the-line conduct is still a pattern. Sometimes the harm is cumulative, and leadership cannot always wait for one perfect incident before acting. I recently read an article from a very different setting about what it called toxic complaints. This is actually for the military. And its advice translates really well here. Document everything, protect the process, do not take shortcuts, use independent review when needed, and do not allow chaos to become normal. The answer to process abuse is not less process, it is better protect process. And that may require more care and formality than anyone would actually want. We all want to be assuming good faith, but the alternative is allowing the people most willing to abuse the rules to define the culture of the group. Standards work is already hard, right? It asks people to build shared infrastructure out of disagreement across organizations, countries, deployment models, technical assumptions, and personal egos. And when someone weaponizes the process, they're not just slowing down a specification, they're making it harder for the next person to believe the work is even worth doing. The goal is not a conflict-free process here, because that would be an absolute fantasy. The goal is a process strong enough to handle disagreement without rewarding abuse. Because when process becomes the thing that drives good people away, it's not protecting your work, it's just consuming it into like a whole bowl of nothing. And that is not what we want. Thank you for listening to my rant. I hope you all learned something from it, and I look forward to chatting with you again next week. And that's it for this week's episode of the Digital Identity Digest. If it helps make things a little clearer, or at least a little more interesting, share it with a friend or colleague, and connect with me on LinkedIn at HL Flanagan. And if you enjoyed the show, do be sure to subscribe and leave me a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find the written full post at sphericalcowconsulting.com. Now stay curious, stay engaged, and let's get these conversations going.